Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
Welcome, dear viewers, to this Mena Watch Talks episode. Starting shortly before the fall of the Assad regime in 2024, we actually began a rather small series on our YouTube channel titled, What Exactly is Happening in Syria Right Now? We always found ourselves in a situation where we discussed current events with Thomas von der Ostensacken over several episodes. We want to continue discussing that now based on the very latest developments. However, this time it's not Thomas as our guest. Instead, we are truly delighted to have and to warmly welcome another guest with us. Syamend Hajo is a distinguished board member at the European Center for Kurdish Studies, and he has just very recently spent time in Syria, specifically in northeast Syria, and has only just returned from there quite recently, so he's freshly back. Thus, he can share his personal experiences with us, and with him, we intend to thoroughly discuss what has transpired in that region over the past few days, and the journey that led us all to this current juncture. So, first and foremost, dear Syamend, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for making the time to join us, and yes, a very warm welcome to our discussion here today.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. I truly hope that we can have a shared, deeply insightful, and ultimately very productive conversation together.
Yes, I'm confident we'll succeed. Let's begin with a rather general question. So, in the last week, over the past few days, the so-called democratic self-administration of North and East Syria has really undergone something significant, you see. The Kurdish autonomous region in northeast Syria has lost almost 90% of its territory to the government forces from Damascus, specifically to various military units associated with Damascus. In large part, it seems to have imploded. What exactly happened there? What unfolded in the last few days?
I believe that the SDF's rapid loss of so much territory within just a few days on one hand is attributable to overconfidence. On the other hand, it also deeply involves the very structure of the SDF itself.
To clarify, SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces, right?
Exactly, those are the Syrian Kurdish forces that, since 2015, have basically been fighting ISIS on behalf of the Americans and practically had almost a third of Syria under their complete control. As I said, it has to do with their structures. The SDF is it is entirely led by Kurds. The entire leadership of the SDF, all decisions, were actually made by Kurds. However, a significant portion of their soldiers, indeed a considerable number of them, were Arabs. And many of those who were watching, who observed the SDF, those who observed or analyzed it consistently predicted that a military confrontation, either with the Syrian regime or the transitional government, was bound to happen if the overwhelming majority of Arabs deserted them. This dire prediction was based on the understanding that such a widespread abandonment would leave them vulnerable and exposed, making conflict almost inevitable given the volatile regional dynamics. And that's precisely what came to pass. Nearly 70% of the SDF forces switched allegiances, both in Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor. That is precisely where the battles initially commenced. Previously, in Aleppo and Sheikh Maqsoud, those two Kurdish districts, and Ashrafiyeh, they had to retreat after several days as well. There too, numerous Arab units collectively switched sides, and precisely the same scenario unfolded in both Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. That's one aspect. So, the question is, why did these Arab fighters desert them, abandoning the SDF? The SDF and the Kurdish self-administration, or rather, the administration of northeast Syria, was by no means democratic, you see. It couldn't establish truly democratic structures. It was an authoritarian regime, even though in the West and among left-leaning circles, it's frequently touted as a democratic exemplar for the Middle East, a beacon of democracy, but in reality it was absolutely nothing of the sort. Time and again it was PKK cadres who made all the decisions, not even Kurds from Syria. Very often they were Kurds from Turkey. And both in the Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish regions, and in the mostly Arab regions, they ruled with an iron fist, indeed. Basically, political criticism was certainly not desired. Since they've been in power, we haven't had any real elections. They weren't legitimized, and it was clear that the Arab majority wouldn't accept it, or rather, as soon as an opportunity presented itself, they would switch sides, and that's exactly what happened. Apart from that, aside from the non-democratic structures, there were no services, neither in the Kurdish regions nor in the Arab regions. We are well aware that the SDF and the Kurdish administration had control over almost all of Syria's oil and natural gas. However, the majority of the population received virtually nothing from these resources. Most of the income and revenues generated from the land, unfortunately, ended up either going directly into their tunnels, disappeared, or, we do know they constructed tunnels everywhere. By now there are some videos where you can see that they really were several hundreds of kilometers long in some instances, both in Raqqa and also in Deir ez-Zor. And indeed, a significant amount of money actually went to the PKK, specifically to Kandil, flowing into their coffers. So these are all the reasons that contributed to its complete collapse. It was truly believed to be the most formidable army throughout all of Syria. With 100,000 fighters, they barely managed to hold their ground against what was essentially a weaker army, predominantly due to the fact that most of their fighters had switched allegiances.
This means, if one compares that with the picture that has often been painted for us and is still being painted, namely on the one side, the democratic Kurdish self-administration, and on the other side, the Islamist barbarians from Damascus. Well, that's really not quite the picture you're painting here at all.
The Islamists' part is true, so there are Islamists and there are Islamist barbarians on the other side, but what they built was not in fact a democratic system. I have been to Damascus several times since the regime was overthrown, as well as to the Kurdish regions, and when you speak with the people in those Kurdish regions, there's hardly anyone who expressed satisfaction with the administration, primarily because they were of the opinion that there were no services, that the people in the region were not being served, no services whatsoever, and that the people in the region were certainly not being served. On the contrary, everyone had to pay immense taxes, starting with taxi drivers and extending all the way up to the shop owners. And despite the fact that they really controlled all of this oil, the citizens additionally had to pay this administration without receiving any services or benefits in return. The infrastructure was ruined, no power, no water, people still had to pay. Many families said, without our European relatives, we'd starve.
Viele Familien haben mir gesagt, wenn nicht unsere Verwandten in Europa wären, würden wir verhungern.
Salaries were barely enough to survive on, even for those employed in administration, ranging from teachers to police officers. They typically received only about $120 per month, which was hardly sufficient to get them through the first 2 weeks. Consequently, they either had to secure a second job or depend on financial support from their relatives residing in Europe. These were all reasons why many Arabs actually left them behind. The image of a barbaric Muslim element is one key reason why Kurds are truly deeply terrified. And despite, even though they're discontent with this administration, they nevertheless perceive that if the government's forces were to march into the Kurdish regions, they would fear similar outcomes. Events such as those that took place in the Alawite regions or in the Druze areas. And there are also indeed specific examples, both from Aleppo, specifically from those two Kurdish districts, and now also Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, where the government troops do not deal kindly with their Kurdish prisoners. That's why people still rally around the SDF and this administration, because they're afraid of, as you mentioned, these Islamic barbarians. That's quite a dilemma. On the one hand, people would gladly get rid of the SDF and this administration, but on the other, they're even more terrified of the alternative. People had made peace with the administration, they know where the limits are, they can gauge them, but these new rulers are absolutely impossible to predict. They have a radical Islamic background, and sometimes they act on it, and in other places they act on it less. And the danger is that if they really get full control of the Kurdish areas, they will fully unleash their radicalism. Many people are afraid of that, which is why many civilians are now arming themselves. It's disastrous. It could end disastrously. If military forces were to march in and these regions were to be taken over, there could indeed be widespread massacres. Furthermore, given that the PYD is currently arming civilians, this situation has the potential to become absolutely explosive. Therefore, I truly hope that this ceasefire will be utilized to initiate a conversation, to return to the negotiating table, and, at the very least, to reach an agreement that the Syrian army, that is to say, the army of the transitional government, does not march into the region. The transitional government not invade the region. If one wants to learn anything from history, specifically Syrian history, which unfortunately isn't done often enough, the first thing this transitional government should have done was to declare the Syrian army must never be deployed within a Syrian city because we are well aware of the atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad's forces. Well, the very first thing that actually should have been decided and agreed upon was, if they wanted to do better than Bashar al-Assad, was to forbid the army from being deployed against its own population throughout Syria. However, they swiftly and unfortunately implemented this in the Alawite regions, where thousands of Alawites met their demise at the hands of the transitional government soldiers in Druze regions, and now the concern is that a similar situation will unfold in the Kurdish regions.
You're speaking of a fear, a concern about what could potentially happen if government troops or forces under the command or authority of the government, which is something we still need to thoroughly discuss, were to invade the larger Kurdish cities. But that implies it's a fear for what the future holds. So far, it has been less terrible than what happened to the Alawites in February of last year and later with the Druze. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, it actually unfolded less terribly because Deir ez-Zor, Suru and Raqqa had been completely evacuated by Kurds, and those areas are now predominantly Arab populated. But they haven't marched into a Kurdish city where Kurds are the majority population. Even in Hasaka, the very next city that would probably be overrun in a military confrontation, nearly all the Kurds had already fled by Tuesday. The only Kurds that are still remaining there are fighters. But the population, the civilians, have left these cities because they absolutely do not trust this new transitional government at all. They still vividly recall the images you just saw of the killings of Alawites and Druze, which are still fresh in their memories, and as I said, they simply do not trust them, especially given these recent events. And the problem is that many individual units within the Syrian Arab army are not entirely under the government's direct control, which creates a complex and concerning situation. And then we also have the tribes, and we know that within this tribal society, revenge plays a truly essential role. There are numerous Arabs, many members of various Arab tribes, who firmly believe they have a significant score to settle with the Kurds, and they will undoubtedly seek revenge. Furthermore, it is also well known that a great many ISIS members have since escaped from prisons, and they too have a truly massive score to settle with the Kurds, and they don't distinguish at all between fighters and civilians. For them, that's enough. We still recall those images of ISIS when they held sway over certain territories. Thousands of Kurds have been murdered simply because of the fact that they are Kurds. And the danger is seriously, very seriously, and genuinely high that exactly that kind of thing will happen, namely that crimes against civilians will begin. And because of this, civilians are also being armed, which in turn is quite disastrous because many people have never held a weapon in their hands. And at the very latest, should it come to a military confrontation, then the civilians will truly become mere cannon fodder. So I hope, as I said, I truly hope that both parties involved in this conflict, recognizing the grave consequences, will come to their senses and reach an agreement to prevent any form of military confrontation from happening.
You mentioned a short while ago that there's a specific window of opportunity lasting just a few days. This situation arose because just yesterday, not the initial one, but another ceasefire agreement was reached. As part of that agreement, a 4-day time limit was granted to the Kurdish negotiation team, allowing them to thoroughly coordinate internally and engage in discussions among themselves. Do you think this negotiation period, something fruitful will emerge? Because so far, especially if you consider the past year, it has often been the case that on an official level, between the government and the Kurdish side, agreements were made, but then simply not accepted by some elements of the SDF. And lately, the Americans have increasingly voiced their complaints, stating that the negotiations themselves were progressing favorably, yet the SDF faction is just not adhering to them.
Well, what does it mean? The SDF isn't sticking to them. The government expects the SDF to surrender, and they're not willing to do that. So it's what, despite a great deal of criticism against the SDF, it is quite clear what the SDF actually wants. The SDF wants that self-administration exists, and I do believe this self-administration must be granted to the Kurds. Damascus can't be making all the decisions for areas that are mostly Kurdish. It was just as wrong for the SDF to administer and govern areas that were predominantly Arab, for a minority to rule over the majority. That was incorrect. Moreover, the people were not given the opportunity to govern themselves. Damascus absolutely must do this. That is a crucial demand from the SDF. By now, I believe. Are they ready for this? To discuss disbandment. I believe that wasn't the situation for a considerable time, but they've come to the realization that they are militarily completely outmatched. Furthermore, it has become abundantly clear to them in recent days that their most crucial ally, the Americans, have utterly abandoned them. Although it should have been evident to them much earlier, especially after his reception at the White House in November and Trump's overwhelming enthusiasm for him, they absolutely should have recognized that their time was unequivocally over. But it should have become definitively clear to them, absolutely clear, when the government was accepted into the international coalition against ISIS. The SDF had been a member up until that point, and it was quite evident that the SDF had been deliberately placed on a deterrent track. Furthermore, it was made clear that should such a military conflict arise, the Americans would not offer them any support. On the contrary, they intended to back the government. I think there are many reasons why the Americans did this. On one hand, there was Turkey's robust support for the transitional government, Saudi Arabia's clear backing, recognition from the international community, his impactful speech before the UN, and various other significant indicators. These were all undeniable signs that the European Union has recently made immense financial commitments to this government. So everything really indicated that they had international support, and if a military conflict were to occur, the SDF could have read all these signs. Indeed, they should have, but they didn't. They truly believed that the Americans would stand by them, or perhaps given their pivotal role in saving the world from ISIS, they imagined that eternal gratitude and unwavering support would surely follow. That's not how it works. In politics, interests play a role, not what kind of role you once played. And moreover, the SDF actually possesses the entire region that it has under its control. So if they had led it democratically and genuinely promoted the infrastructure and had fostered the well-being of the people as one should have done, actually truly supported them, been able to bring real prosperity. They actually could have done that because they had an incredible amount of resources available to them for such an undertaking. I truly believe if they had actually done that, then they would have had much more international support. They didn't do any of that, and as I said, they were overconfident, and the result, alas, is what we see. Furthermore, one must also consider the role of the PKK. The SDF is not free, the administration was not free. Instead, we have PKK cadres who regrettably made many decisions, and many poor decisions are also attributable to PKK cadres. These are people who spent 30 years in the mountains and then suddenly believed they could make decisions, for instance, about urban planning within these regions. They made many decisions and wielded considerable decision-making authority, despite being utterly incompetent and lacking the requisite skills or experience, and they were directly involved in the SDF's decision-making process as well. And I truly believe that this stands as a pivotal reason for this profound misjudgment and for the devastating sudden collapse of the Kurdish administration alongside the complete breakdown of its military wing within that very administration. I truly hope that it doesn't lead to new military confrontations. That reason will indeed prevail and people will come to their senses. But, unfortunately, I genuinely believe that the SDF is actually not interested in engaging in a military conflict. But the government has now got a taste for it. Shara has really got a taste for it, and he genuinely believes that now. He expects a complete surrender and is absolutely unwilling to compromise. I believe that the government is currently the side that truly desires a war, absolutely unwilling to compromise, and instead seeks only to dictate its own terms. And it's always difficult when one side dictates the terms. There's always the other side, which naturally wants to defend itself, or rather, aims to assert its own perspective, even when confronted with such difficult circumstances. Wants to aggressively impose its own particular vision. Also, I truly hope that the regime, or let me put it this way, if there isn't international pressure, if the international community doesn't exert pressure on this regime, I truly believe it could end very, very badly. They truly believe they can simply march through now, just as they marched from Aleppo to Damascus before, and they've seen for themselves just how vulnerable the SDF truly is, how inherently weak it appears, and that could embolden them to actually take that final, decisive step and launch an assault on the predominantly Kurdish region.
Mentioned, but there is absolutely nothing of that in sight, at least at this moment. The Americans have, yes, made it more than crystal clear what they think of the situation. So, Thomas Barak, the special envoy for Syria for the American government, just recently stated or declared, with an unprecedented level of clarity, yes, the autonomous self-administration had a justification under Assad, but the Assad regime no longer exists, and with that, its justification is now completely gone. So from that perspective, I don't think any help is to be expected. And there were reports as well that Kurdish units or SDF units had sought protection or assistance from the Americans in recent days amidst military confrontations, but the Americans simply did not respond. Let's look back a bit. How did we get here? So we had the fall of Assad in December 2024, and from then on, there was always a fundamental contradiction between what the government wants and what the autonomous administration wanted. So, on the one hand, a centrally governed Syria that also encompasses the Kurdish territories versus the vision of a new federal Syria where some form of autonomous self-governance absolutely must be preserved. That was really the fundamental contradiction the entire time.
Yeah, actually, initially when the revolution began, the PYD, or more accurately the PKK, had in fact struck quite a significant deal with the regime. At that time, the PYD and the YPG, which serves as the political arm of the PYD, would take over the Kurdish territories entirely, and the regime would fully withdraw from the area. In fact, there were no confrontations, no military clashes of any kind with the Syrian army at that time, specifically in 2012. It was a handover, and it was meant to be a temporary handover. So the regime's idea was there are uprisings and armed insurrections everywhere, as well as demonstrations. We can't control all of Syria, so we'll temporarily hand over the territories to the PYD until we have the upper hand in the other regions again, and then later we'll get these territories back. That never actually came to fruition because, in the interim, ISIS grew increasingly powerful, and the Americans were frantically searching for a military partner. They attempted to establish military units alongside various Arab opposition factions, but this effort failed either because their weaponry fell into ISIS's hands or the allocated funds vanished. And with the PKK and PYD, they actually found a truly dependable partner, one who was entirely prepared to act as mercenaries and was willing to fight for American and Western interests. And in exchange for that, they received weapons and money. And it was international recognition for the isolated PKK. Through the PYD, it gained its recognition, and it was this very isolation. It actually managed to break completely out of this isolation. It was always clear that it was and the Americans never made a secret of the fact that this was a temporary coalition, that its sole purpose was to fight ISIS. No political demands were ever attached to this, and indeed neither the PYD nor the SDF ever actually tried to enforce any political demands as a condition for their cooperation. And of course, Bashar al-Assad was always interested in reintegrating these territories. But as long as the Americans were there, and as long as American military was there and supported the SDF, it was very difficult for Bashar al-Assad to get these areas under control. But with the regime change, with Shara, who until then was known as Julani, and had a $10 million bounty on his head because he was considered a terrorist, that has yes, the cards have been reshuffled, indeed. And so, all of a sudden, we had Julani, who was being courted, or as he's now known, Shara being courted by the entire global community. And everyone was hoping that he would bring stability to the region. He was actually supported. Turkey supported him, Saudi Arabia supported him, the entire West supported him. And I find it to be a rather damning indictment for the Western community, or perhaps more accurately, the West has completely lost all credibility in the Middle East, in my opinion. Or, to phrase it differently, it actually encourages those who were long considered terrorists, so long as they manage to seize power. They become really serious partners. So, practically within just 2 short weeks, he was no longer considered a terrorist. He was simply removed from the list, so either he truly was a terrorist and should have been held accountable for his actions, or the West and the Americans wrongly labeled someone a terrorist who, in fact, was not one at all. Right, so, and as soon as someone is in power, they are no longer considered a terrorist, they are not. I genuinely believe this has done no favors for the Middle East, nor has it helped with the radicalization of the region. Others could then simply mimic this and effectively declare, well, if I choose to, I can indeed carry out acts of terror. I can oppress people and indeed I can implement radical policies. Provided that I come into power, then I will be granted amnesty. And they actually did that with Julani. That's one aspect. The second is that they're abandoning one of their most crucial partners, someone they've been financially supporting ever since 2015. The SDF, effectively established by the Americans, was suddenly abandoned, quite literally overnight, because a more cost-effective partner was found. Julani will indeed prove less expensive for the West and for the Americans, as both Saudi Arabia and Turkey are providing substantial support, financially and with weaponry. And because it's believed that the new interim government should ideally bring everything under control as quickly as possible, this includes supplying them with weapons and providing extensive support. And I think the absolute worst part, the most dreadful thing about all of this, is this special envoy, the American special envoy for Syria, Thomas Barrack, whom you just mentioned, was definitely the worst. He believes neither in democracy nor does he believe in authoritarian-led states. He stated his opinion quite clearly that democracy simply isn't suitable for the Middle East, and similarly that federalism and decentralized governing structures are also not meant for the Middle East. And that's disastrous because I believe democratic structures are crucial everywhere in the world, and you simply cannot claim that democracy isn't beneficial for one specific region of the world. In my opinion, that is clearly racist, without a doubt. And decentralized structures were introduced precisely because the prevailing opinion was that the people at the lowest levels should be empowered to govern themselves and to decide for themselves what truly serves their best interests. They are not in the center, not in the capital. All decisions shouldn't be made there. Instead, decisions should be made as close to the people as possible, you see. And that's why we have this decentralized structure. This individual asserts that such a setup isn't suitable for the Middle East, instead favoring centralized systems. He goes on to claim that federalism has universally failed, citing Lebanon, which isn't even federalist, and Iraq, where he insists it has demonstrably faltered. I don't believe Iraq has failed. I mean, if you consider it, Iraq's institutions are clearly functioning quite well, even though there's been a substantial amount of external influence. Iran, for example, is incredibly destabilizing to the region, yet despite all of this, Iraq's institutions continue to operate. Nevertheless, ever since the new constitution was established in Iraq, since Saddam Hussein has been gone, we've had stable institutions, we hold regular elections, and have experienced changing governments. They are definitely developing democratic institutions, but nonetheless Iraq is still functioning. And the reason Iraq hasn't seen greater success is precisely because not all of these federal structures have been fully established and implemented yet. Normally federal countries have a two-chamber system. In Iraq we have a one-chamber system. We normally have a constitutional court. For a long time Iraq didn't have a constitutional court. So the fact that it's not working isn't due to federalism, but rather because the federal structures haven't been fully established. And then this Barak fellow comes along and claims federalism isn't good for the Middle East. So, what's the alternative? If you don't have federal or decentralized structures, what do you have? You have centralized structures, and we know that in Syria those centralized structures led to disaster. A small clique had all the power in their grasp. They controlled the entire economy and completely dominated the military might, holding it firmly in their hands. And we've witnessed the catastrophic consequences it brought forth. So if you say you don't want a decentralized structure, you're saying you want one thing. You want centralized structures, which in Syria have definitely cost thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. There have been several million refugees. This war, which has already lasted over 13 years, is attributable, among other things, to these powerful centralized structures. And it has been demonstrated that there are groups within Syria who steadfastly refuse to be governed by Damascus. These are the Druze, the Alawites, and the Kurds, specifically. If you really want to break out of this vicious cycle, you have to look at creating decentralized structures, giving self-administration, a special status for the Kurdish and Druze areas, for the Alawites. There isn't yet that specific political group, that particular political grouping, which genuinely desires federalism and truly wants to achieve it. But nevertheless, I also firmly believe that there absolutely must be a special status for Alawite areas. And it's vitally important for us to collectively ensure that Damascus, that Syria, of course, absolutely remains a unified state, but with these special statutes, for example. For instance, in Italy, we have 5 regions that are granted special status. Despite this, Italy is not disintegrating, and the unity of the state is perfectly preserved. However, I truly believe that the unity of Syria, or for that matter, any real stability within Syria, will only be achievable if these diverse ethnic groups are granted the autonomy to govern themselves in some capacity rather than being solely administered from Damascus.
Well, concerning Thomas Barrack, I believe the core of the problem lies, partially in his own character, but primarily in the reality that his superior holds democratic structures and authoritarian ones in equally low regard, and isn't particularly against authoritarian rule as a governing system. Thus, the problem likely lies a level or two higher than that. Let's go back. How did we get to this point? There already was an agreement back in March between the regional administration and the government in Damascus, or the interim government in Damascus. And even back then, a comprehensive roadmap was essentially agreed upon, a detailed plan, if you will, for the thorough integration of the Kurdish territories and their respective units into the nascent Syrian institutions. Why did nothing come of it? Was it not meant seriously from the Kurdish side from the start, or what caused it to fail?
I truly believe it primarily failed because these negotiations, I believe, were actually led by the wrong side involved. Mazlum Abdi conducted the negotiation, the SDF conducted the negotiation. Mazlum Abdi is a military commander, but he is not a political representative of the Kurds. We have political organizations. I believe they should have conducted these negotiations. Mazlum Abdi consistently stated, "I am not responsible for the political side of things. I only make military agreements." However, the initial points of those March negotiations you mentioned were actually political in nature. And most of the Kurdish political parties did not support those two particular points or proposals. And Mazlum Abdi repeatedly stated in his conversations that he had reached an agreement with al-Shara, indicating that a Kurdish delegation would be negotiating Kurdish demands. Therefore, it is the Kurdish politicians who should be undertaking these actions. And this is precisely why, in April of 2025, a significant conference was convened, bringing together nearly all of the prominent Kurdish parties to discuss this matter. They reached an agreement on various political demands and subsequently appointed a committee comprised of 11 individuals who were tasked with the responsibility of negotiating with Damascus. And Damascus was indeed the one that blocked it. There were constant, repeated requests from this delegation to engage in discussions, but al-Shara and the transitional government firmly rejected those advances. Even today, he has not engaged or involved himself with them at all. He, al-Shara, considers himself to be the only legitimate political representative of the Syrians, and thus far he has not engaged in meetings with any other political party, including those of Arab descent. He refuses. He's basically ruling, or would like to rule, just like the Ba'ath party. He and his HTS, his Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, consider themselves the sole true representatives of Syria. He and his group make all political decisions for Syria and refuse to negotiate with other factions, as he doesn't even acknowledge their legitimacy. Therefore, if you view yourself as the exclusive representative of the Syrians, you are not prepared to negotiate with others. And that is, I believe, the essential problem at hand. We have these 11 representatives here who represent the entire Kurdish political landscape, encompassing all Kurdish groups. Well, there were some who weren't present at this conference because they had stated, "We're not satisfied with how this conference was arranged, it's actually not democratic," and so on and so forth. However, the declaration, the joint political statement, those demands they put forth, which I believe was a 12-point plan, received the full backing of all Kurdish political parties. They unequivocally stated, "These are precisely the demands we insist be negotiated with Damascus." However, Damascus has consistently declined to engage in discussions with the political representatives of the Kurds. And that, I believe, is what needs to happen now. So if al-Shara is serious about talks, he doesn't need to negotiate with the SDF. He can negotiate political and military issues with the SDF, but political matters require talks with political representatives. Those are Syria's true Kurdish representatives, and he must negotiate, but he refuses. So, the lack of progress isn't primarily due to the SDF, I believe, but rather to the interim government, which views itself as the sole legitimate representative of Syria, and is therefore unwilling to engage in discussions and negotiations with representatives from other groups. Well, if he hasn't shown this willingness until now, as you've mentioned, particularly when the regional government still held a seemingly stable position, it's highly improbable he'll alter his views now that he has dismantled significant portions of this autonomous region. So, There's little reason for optimism, I would assume. Yes, as I said, I believe the al-Shara interim government will now dictate its terms. He sees he has international support and also actually possesses the military strength to enforce his will and assert himself. And as I said, I believe there are two main scenarios. Either they'll manage to reach a political agreement, and I'm just not sure to what extent that's even feasible, because by this point, is something like the US acting as a mediator sufficient for that? Or is something like that even possible without a third party acting as an organizer for such negotiations? The US could have acted as a mediator all along, but they don't want to. So you're absolutely right that we have a president who fundamentally doesn't believe in democracy and shares a similar authoritarian mindset with the interim president in Syria. So yes, you need a mediator who truly believes in human rights, who believes in minority rights, and in who genuinely believes in, that democratic structures are in the interest of the people in Syria, that there are democratic institutions. But when you have a US president who doesn't believe in it himself, and then you have a representative, his representative is no better than him, and constantly pours oil on the fire. Tom Barrack, to be perfectly honest, you really haven't been helpful in the slightest up until this point, and you have unequivocally embraced the viewpoint of the Syrian transitional government, which insists that the Kurds must surrender and find contentment solely in having their linguistic and cultural rights acknowledged and extended. But that won't achieve anything. It's mainly about political rights. The Kurdish movement, which has existed in Syria since the 30s, has always had political demands, always sought political rights, and it was never just about cultural and linguistic rights. However, what the government offers them are merely linguistic and cultural rights, and that simply isn't sufficient for the Kurdish people. They haven't made such immense sacrifices merely to be appeased by being allowed to speak Kurdish privately, or to have just 1 hour of Kurdish language instruction within the schools. They want decentralized structures. They want their own region that they can administer themselves, where there is a Kurdish majority present. They want to have a say in the central government, and naturally they want to establish a more inclusive system. A Syria where other components, other minorities also possess similar rights, particularly for their benefit. And what the regime offers them is simply not enough, not sufficient. However, both the Americans, that is, both Tom Barrack, the representative, and the entire US government will exert pressure on the Kurds in this particular direction because they are convinced that it is considered more vital to have the peace of the graveyard in Syria to establish stable conditions, if that's the case, but this is genuinely short-sighted. We might achieve stable conditions, but it's going to be very short-lived. The revolution that happened in Syria, the 13 years of war we experienced there, was due to a complete lack of political freedoms, not only for the Kurds, but for many Syrian Arabs as well. A small, powerful clique held total control, leaving no room for any opposition. And that is exactly what is happening in Damascus right now. So, while we criticize the fact that in the Kurdish areas, PKK cadres very often made the decisions, nowadays, if you go to Damascus and ask people who truly holds the power here, who actually makes the decisions? It isn't the minister, unless, of course, he's a member of HTS. It isn't, for example, the Kurdish Minister for Education, nor is it Hind Kabawat, the Christian Minister for Labor and Social Affairs. Instead, it is the sheikhs who wield the actual influence and power. Yes, they call them sheikh, whenever you ask who is it who makes the decisions. Indeed, it's some sheikh no one recognizes, but they're actually the ones calling the shots. These are Hayat Tahrir al-Sham individuals, frequently possessing radical Islamic backgrounds, and their presence won't usher in stability for Syria. Instead, as I previously mentioned, it might bring a fleeting sense of calm for a couple of years. However, ultimately, once these individuals solidify their grip on power, they will undoubtedly act with the same brutality as the former regime. Then we'll witness demonstrations once more, with people resorting to arms, and within a few short years, we'll be plunged into yet another war in Syria, a civil war to be precise. And the Americans don't see that, the West doesn't see that, it's regrettable. For them, what's crucial is having short-term peace and quiet. For Europe, for Germany, it's vital to repatriate its Syrian refugees with the utmost urgency, as swiftly as humanly possible. For Israel, it's absolutely vital to come to an agreement with this particular regime concerning the Golan Heights, perhaps, that the new government relinquishes it, meaning that its own interests are maintained and potentially achieves greater benefits for the Druze community than it would for other factions. Yes. That's crucial for Israel. That's also precisely why Israel is remaining very quiet and has issued hardly any statements concerning the events of the past few days for Americans. Yes, it's crucial to have a powerful president, one they can easily manipulate, strong at home, yet pliable and weak when it comes to American interests. And that person happens to be the new president. He will accept all of the conditions set by the Americans. So because of that, I genuinely believe this policy will lead to a dead end in Syria. One more quick thing, because you can't ignore it.
That one simply cannot overlook when speaking about this particular subject. So, what exactly was Turkey's role in this whole situation throughout the past week? Did Turkey truly push for, or perhaps even initiate, a significant military escalation there in the region? Or what exactly was Turkey's role? Did the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army in the north somehow participate in the offensive even recently, or how did that situation unfold?
Well, there were rumors that this actually happened in Aleppo, but it was less prevalent, much less so in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, as I said, it truly wasn't necessary because a significant number of SDF fighters abandoned them, effectively stabbing them in the back, so to speak. So it wasn't even needed. Of course, Turkey has a vested interest in the SDF being weakened, in the Kurdish self-administration being undermined, and, if at all possible, in there being no self-administration whatsoever, but they weren't directly involved. But regardless, Turkey has supported Sharas from the very beginning, providing both intelligence and military aid, as it was in their geopolitical interest to do so. They share a rather lengthy border, you see, with Syria, and they were quite keen, through significant and steadfast support, to effectively secure Sharas' allegiance. And I believe that they were somewhat successful in achieving that goal. Nevertheless, Sharas' alignment is not with Turkey, but actually with the Arab world, specifically Saudi Arabia, and he still receives ample support from them. Yes, I would definitely say he received military assistance from Turkey. Directly involved, I think they were only in Aleppo and those two districts. After that, Turkey didn't need to intervene directly. I think if Turkey had seen that this transitional government or the army of the transitional government was facing defeat, then they might have intervened, but it wasn't necessary to intervene.
Eine Niederlage erlebt, dann hätten sie vielleicht interveniert, aber das war nicht nötig zu intervenieren.
Perhaps, toward the end of our conversation, let's briefly touch upon the humanitarian situation. You mentioned that from the areas still remaining in northeastern Syria, many people are also fleeing, and from the cities, from the larger cities. I spoke with Thomas yesterday, who is in Suleymaniye right now, and he says they have their hands full there because they expect a huge wave of refugees from Syria into Iraqi Kurdistan. Where are these people fleeing to at the moment?
So far, they are fleeing to the region that is under the control of the Kurdish self-administration, or the SDF. The border regions are being emptied, with people departing from the villages situated directly along the frontier. One of the larger cities, Hasaka, is, as I mentioned, almost entirely free of Kurds. They are all going to Kamishli and the surrounding areas, Derbisiya, Amuda, Derik, that is where all these people are currently fleeing to. However, it is a fact that there will indeed be a significant and devastating humanitarian catastrophe should a military confrontation unfortunately occur. So, Many people will try to get to safety indeed. As previously stated, there's absolutely no trust in this government, and I firmly believe that this distrust is entirely justified. There's a really profound concern, that particularly young men will either find themselves locked away in prison or tragically, ultimately they'll be shot, That is the very real fear that people have. And then all the people who have worked with the administration, they recall what happened in Afrin when Arab militias took over. They truly remember that, vividly, and it remains a clear memory for them. Everyone who had any connection to the administration was imprisoned, and some were even brutally tortured, while others simply vanished without a trace. Some people are very much afraid that this will simply repeat itself. Given how the West and the Americans are reacting right now, it is not anticipated that they will make an effort to prevent this situation from unfolding. Or perhaps their new partner, Sharis, and the transitional government will likely receive this advice from someone like me, who knows Tom Barra. If you're going to commit human rights violations, please do so discreetly, away from public view. So, no more cell phones everywhere, please. Such advice will undoubtedly be given to them, I believe. And because of this, people are truly fearing the absolute worst outcomes, and that is precisely why. Many people will definitely attempt to flee, particularly seeking refuge in Iraqi Kurdistan. They'll try to cross over, We're well aware that the Kurdish regions of Turkey are separated by a wall, but people will likely attempt to escape to the other side, into Turkey, even if it means risking being shot. This is a desperate measure born out of fear. Conversely, we have witnessed the opposite situation unfold. Many individuals in support of Turkey have fled from Turkish Kurdistan to Syrian Kurdistan, seeking refuge in Syria. But I truly believe that if military conflict erupts, families and the elderly, in particular, will attempt to escape to Iraqi Kurdistan or even Turkish Kurdistan.
There's one last point in all of this that I just don't understand, because it seems so incredibly short-sighted to me. Why on earth would the Americans stand by and watch as thousands of ISIS terrorists are freed from prisons?
Yes, I've asked myself that same question. The West, and particularly the Americans, genuinely invested a significant amount to ensure that the SDF would be able to control these captured ISIS militants, and that these crucial prisons would indeed be properly maintained and kept operational. Well, that's also something the global community truly made far too easy for itself, wouldn't you agree? I mean, these people were truly living under the most terrible conditions imaginable, and, to put it mildly, people who, since 2015, some even since 2016 or 2018, have been held without proper court proceedings, entire families and children alike. I mean, that was truly brutal, and the international community just didn't care at all. And for the Americans to now just stand by and allow thousands of these individuals to be released is simply unbelievable. These people will probably react against the prisons. I mean, for 5, 6, or 7 years, dating back to 2015, these individuals have been held in custody. They were living under the absolute worst conditions imaginable, and I can completely understand if these people now feel they have the right to. And some people were actually imprisoned even though they weren't ISIS members whatsoever. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time and have been detained for 5, 6, 7 years without any due process, save for likely just some basic interrogation. That there were adequate interrogations, But these people were in prison without a proper court hearing, and the West and the Americans are responsible for that. But the Kurds are the ones who will ultimately pay the price. That price will be, if these thousands of people, they'll also join up with these tribes and parts of the Syrian army. And if it comes to a military confrontation, these groups will indeed act with true and utter brutality.
What I simply cannot fathom in this entire situation is, it certainly can't be in America's best interest that now, as we're reading in reports, thousands, potentially even thousands, of ISIS prisoners, who up until now were guarded by the SDF, are just being released into freedom and will likely rejoin their terror operations. So why on earth are the Americans merely standing by and watching?
Honestly, I just can't grasp it either. The Americans invested a tremendous amount of resources to have these prisons so that ISIS prisoners, yes, could be held, some of them since 2015, 16, 17. And truly, these prisoners pose a significant danger for Syria, but most notably for the Kurds. Because many individuals have been held captive, some since 2015 and primarily since 2016, without any legal court proceedings. Many innocent people too. They were at the wrong time, sometimes in the wrong place, and the West simply took it for granted. For them, it wasn't of importance to ensure proper court proceedings. It definitely could have been done, but they left it to the Kurds to handle these individuals, detain them, and they will, or rather, let's just say this, many of these prisoners, there are numerous reports suggesting they're joining the Syrian Arab army and aligning with various Arab tribes, and they will, without a doubt, have a major score to settle with the Kurds. I believe they will, if a military confrontation were to happen, they will act with extreme brutality. They will try. All of them, their frustration or their radicalism, which from some perspectives is actually quite understandable, will cause them to indeed attempt to, all these things are going to be used against them. To exact revenge in a brutal manner. And I genuinely hope that perhaps the Syrian army, or rather the Syrian transitional government, manages to exert some influence to prevent this from happening, to stop Arab tribes from intervening, and to ensure that these brutal campaigns of revenge are not carried out. But I seriously doubt it. Like, how would one, based on my experience with this government and the past experiences? However, in Sueda, I seriously doubt that anyone will be able to restrain or hold these individuals back. That's why I truly believe that the Kurds are going to pay a very high price, should it come to that, a military confrontation to erupt, and these ISIS prisoners pose a significant threat, primarily to the Kurds, but I believe eventually to this government as well. I absolutely cannot comprehend the American behavior either, actually, unless they are genuinely no longer prepared to do so, to make investments. They're no longer willing to, yes, I can definitely imagine that with this American administration, at some point they will declare not only that, thus, they're not saying they're withdrawing from Syria in such a short span. We have a government, the Syrian government should make certain that it addresses its own issues and effectively handles these ISIS members and ISIS detainees. Well, it's quite possible this is a preliminary step, a preparation for them to simply declare, this is not our issue, and you need to figure out how to deal with your ISIS prisoners yourselves. That could definitely happen.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be entirely surprising, considering that Trump already announced during his first term that he would withdraw the roughly 2,000 US soldiers who were there at the time. He didn't do it then, but it's certainly not as if that thought hadn't already crossed his mind on more than just one or two occasions. Well then, despite this overall rather pessimistic outlook, I would definitely like to express my gratitude for you taking the time and for attempting to elucidate the background and developments for us here. Yes, let's hope it all turns out better than we have to fear, so thank you again. And to all of you, our esteemed viewers, as always, we kindly ask that if you found this content intriguing, if you appreciate our videos, please do us the favor of leaving a like or consider subscribing to our channel. Please comment under our videos, make your remarks, whatever you'd like.